Sarah Breger is deputy editor of Moment magazine and director of the Daniel Pearl Investigative Initiative. Sarah has won numerous awards, including first place for Religion Reporting of the Year from the Religion News Association and first place for Best In-Depth News Writing on Religion from the American Academy of Religion. Gil Troy is a distinguished scholar in North American history at McGill University and currently lives in Jerusalem. He is an award-winning American presidential historian and a leading Zionist activist. He is the author of many books on the American presidency, as well as several books on Zionism, including Moynihan's Moment, America's Fight Against Zionism as Racism. Mr. Troy has appeared as a featured commentator on CNN's popular multi-part documentaries, the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s. He has published essays in the American, Canadian, and Israeli media, and writes a monthly column for the Daily Beast, Secret Lives, putting current events in historical perspective. And he writes a weekly column for the Jerusalem Post. Gil was recently designated an Allgemeiner J100, one of the top 100 people positively influencing Jewish life. Natan Sharansky, born in Ukraine, was a spokesman for the human rights movement, a prisoner of Zion, and leader in the struggle for the right of Soviet Jews to immigrate to Israel. After his request to make Aliyah, Mr. Sharansky was arrested on trumped-up charges of treason and espionage. He was convicted in a Soviet court and served 9 years in the Gulag, with many stretches in a punishing cell. Following massive public campaigns by the State of Israel, World Jewry, and leaders of the free world, Mr. Sharansky was released in 1986, making Aliyah on the very day of his release. In his first few years in Israel, Mr. Sharansky established the Zionist Forum to assist Soviet Olim in their absorption in Israel. In the 1990s, he established the Yisrael Ba'aliyah Party in order to accelerate the integration of Russian Jews. He served in 4 successive Israeli governments as minister and deputy prime minister. From 2009 to 2018, Natan Sharansky served as chairman of the executive of the Jewish Agency for Israel, and in 2018 received the highest Israeli award, the Israel Prize for promoting Aliyah and the ingathering of the exiles. In July 2019, he became the chair of the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. Mr. Sharansky is the only living non-American citizen who is the recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor and the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He is the author of 4 books, including Never Alone, Prison, Politics, and My People, that he co-authored with Gil Troy, and which you will hear more about today. It is my honor to introduce Sarah Breger, Gil Troy, and Natan Sharansky.
Thanks, Suzanne, and thank you for organizing this. Natan and Gil, thank you guys for staying up so late. It's past my bedtime there, so really appreciate it. Moedim l'simcha. Natan, the last time we talked was in March, just at the beginning of the shutdown. And you actually spoke a little bit about some tips you had for being in isolation. I'm curious, 6 months later, has your advice changed at all? Are you still as optimistic as you were back then?
Well, my advice was based on my many years experience in solitary confinement and punishing cell. So, of course, 6 months of Corona don't undermine this experience. For example, I can remind you among my 5 advices was, of course, to remember that you are a soldier of the big army and you have a very special role, and the victory depends also on you. So you have to feel this responsibility. And on the other hand, to be able always to laugh on the situation and to share jokes and so on. But one very important advice was there that don't depend on things which don't depend on it, which you cannot really control. You cannot control when it will finish. So if you start planning that, okay, in 1 month, we'll go on vacations, or in 10 days, everything will change, you'll be disappointed again and again. Depend on things which depend fully on you. Like you can make plans to study the language or to teach your children another language, or something like this that fully depends on you. You can plan it and you can make sure that it will be achieved. And today, when I hear so many complaints how it was disappointing, then 2 weeks ago and 1 month ago, it didn't finish. I think people should follow the same advice. Build your plans, it's very important. Make sure that you achieve your goals, but don't make yourself dependent on the things which don't depend on you. In prison, I did know that it doesn't depend on me whether I will survive physically, because it depends on KGB, and they're not going to give up to KGB. But it depends only on me if I'll remain free person in prison. And when the aim that you put fully depends on you, you can demand from yourself to do it.
And even though the book was written, before the pandemic, a lot of those themes emerge in the book itself. Gil, I was curious how the book came about and why you guys decided to structure it the way that you did.
First of all, good evening. It's a real pleasure to be with you. And thanks for all the work in organizing this. It's a funny thing because when you hear our biographies, you, Sarah, and I are very similar in that we're children of freedom, we're children of the free world, and we've figured out how to work in our professions. And Natan's biography is obviously very, very different. So we're in some ways a very unlikely duo to be writing a book together. But I think that was also sort of the power of the collaboration. We were very much co-authors. We argued about every word, every sentence, how to structure it, how to create a certain logic. But ideologically, we were very much on the same page. And the idea of the book very much came from Natan. Natan was finishing his 9th year at the Jewish Agency. And he likes to say that he served 9 years in the Gulag, 9 years in Israeli politics, and 9 years in the Jewish Agency. And we literally signed a contract for the book 999. And that is the structure of the book, because we wanted to tell the story. And we call this a memoir festo, because we're using stories from Natan's life and the arc of Natan's biography to tell a broader story and to put forth broader ideas. So it's a memoir and a manifesto. And the broader ideas are the power of the Jewish people. The broader ideas are the power of being connected to something very powerful to you, being a part of a people, being a part of this network, but also always fighting for freedom. And that dance between identity and freedom has been a central theme of his life coming from the Soviet Union and my life growing up in New York. And while he was in the Gulag, I was at Harvard in the 1980s. We've had very different experiences, but together we saw the power of both the democratic commitment to freedom, free speech, free thought, and the deep Jewish value of belonging. And the book had this working title of 999. That's how we signed the book contract. But at the end of the day, the name of the book is Never Alone, because during all those years that Natan Sharansky was in the Gulag and the KGB kept on telling him, you're forgotten, you're abandoned. And think of what he just said. He pointed out that he was living on a different plane. He was living not in day-to-day time, but on historic time. And he said he knew he was never alone. And if for 75 years we've been obsessed with never again, and of course it's so important that we revere our Holocaust martyrs, now we look out to the next generation and we say, when you're a part of this amazing network called the Jewish people, you're never alone. And that's the title of the book.
I was wondering if it was a play on Never Again. I liked in the book.
It doesn't work in Hebrew, unfortunately. We don't have the same game.
Actually, I was just curious, is this book published in Hebrew as well?
We're working on translating it.
Not yet.
On translating it to Hebrew and to Russian.
Oh, okay. I liked also the part in the book where you said having served 9 years in each one. I don't know where I suffered the most. That was very
well,
funny.
I do know. The most enjoyable life, of course, is in prison. It's difficult physically, but spiritually, morally, you say no to KGB every day, and you fulfilled all Taryag mitzvot, all 613 commandments which you as a Jew can do, you did. So it's a very full life there, and very simple. The government, you are never sure that you really did all your obligations. You don't know whether the compromise which you reach every day with your partners is something that you should do or should not do. So it's much more difficult life.
It's actually, it's similar to what you said when you talked about how, dissidents can be pure, but politicians can't. I'm curious, what made you want to enter politics in the first place?
Well, I entered politics not because I wanted. In fact, I didn't want. I came out of the prison with such a feeling of connectedness to every Jew in the world that the last thing that I wanted is to join one group against the other group. But when I went out of prison, I was the first political prisoner who was released under Gorbachev. And all the other political prisoners and all the other refuseniks and all the Jews who wanted to leave were still behind. So we continued our struggle, naturally. And then when the Iron Curtain fell some years after this, and huge Aliyah started, I felt my responsibility, and we tried to help to the integration of this Aliyah, but then it became clear that Aliyah is so huge that in order really to guarantee its integration into Israeli society, we need to have political tools. We need to have influence on the budget of the state, on the priorities of the state, and the most important that in order these people will feel themselves at home, they must be part of the decision-making process. And that's how I entered the politics, with this idea that we must give voice to this Aliyah, and we succeeded.
If I can add, as an American who grew up in freedom, I would hear about Soviet dissidents or Iranian dissidents. And I would think that each one was different, because I thought that I didn't think of dissidents as a kind of separate category. I thought more about the struggle that you had to fight for freedom in the Soviet Union or in the Palestinian Authority or in Iran. And one of the things I learned from the book was how similar it is to be a dissident in all these different, what we call fear societies, in all these different dictatorships, and the connection. And it was actually quite striking sometimes. Natan would sit and tell his story about overcoming fear, overcoming doublethink, standing up for his rights and becoming a free person, even while the KGB still essentially controls him. And then we found a book about the Arab Spring, and we hear testimonies from people in Libya, people in Yemen, people in Egypt, people in Iran who don't know Natan Sharansky, don't know the Soviet Union, and they describe a remarkably similar experience. Now, on the other end, when you talk about people like Václav Havel, when you talk about people who were lucky enough to experience, as Natan did, the slavery, but also the freedom, another thing that links them is dissidents have a very hard time being in politics because, as he points out, the compromise. So we see that I actually learned that there is this phenomenon, there is this thing called dissidents, and they share a common language, they share common experiences, and they also share common frustrations when they enter freedom sometimes.
You mentioned doublethink. That pops up a lot in the book. Could you explain what that concept is, and then how you see it kind of popping up in discourse today?
Well, as I describe in the book, in my childhood, in my early years, I was deprived of identity. I had nothing Jewish in my life except from anti-Semitism. And I was deprived of freedom. From the age of 5, I knew exactly on what society I lived, because the day when Stalin died, my father explains to me, 5-year-old boy, that it is very good for us, for Jews, that he died, that it really saves us, but that I should not tell it to know anybody. I should do what everybody does. And next day, the kindergarten, I cry together with all the children about death of Stalin. I sing together with all the children about this son of all the people, Stalin. And I think how happy I should be that he died. And I have no idea how many children are really crying or how many children are crying like me, pretending. So that is a typical life of Soviet citizen, when there is one thing what you're saying, what you're doing, how you're voting, what you're reading, and you know that it's all lie. The other thing, it's the real life, which the true life, which is only for your family and for close friends. And that's what I say, double thing, that Soviet people were used to live all our life double think, in self-censorship. It was extremely uncomfortable. And only when I rediscovered my identity and joined the history of my people and the struggle of my people, suddenly you have enough strength to stop with this double think and to have a free life. And for me, it was always the sign of dictatorship that people are living in the double think. And as Gil mentioned, dissidents are those who are crossing this line between double think and freedom. What was so upsetting, and we write a lot about it in our book, that many years after this, first traveling in America between different universities, I discovered more and more, then it was mainly young Jewish students who were saying that though they support Israel, they agree with the fight against boycotting Israel, but they feel that because it can influence on their career, because some of their professors will not like it, they prefer to be silent for some time. And then this phenomenon was becoming broader, and in the last months, there was some poll in America, Cato Institute poll, that 62% of Americans prefer to hide their political views or not to speak about their political views. It's something unbelievable that the doublethink can enter free society in such big numbers. It's really frightening, and that's something to think about and to be alarmed by all of us. And I want to remind that that's something which doesn't depend on the governments, doesn't depend on KGB. It depends on each of us, whether we will decide to say publicly what we think or not.
People have a tendency to complain about what's going on the college campus, and they focus on the ultimately very small number of marginal Jewish voices who are truly, truly anti-Israel. And of course, there's a megaphone effect there because the media loves man bites dog. The Palestinian extremists love those people and they get extra attention. But what Natan encountered in 2002, and I encountered in my years of activism at McGill campus and elsewhere, is less the problem of those few marginal voices, but more these people who are the mainstream, who love Israel, who support Israel, who may have gone now on birthright, but they feel intimidated. They don't feel free on the most amazing college campuses in the world. And I always say, look at me, I'm a case of arrested development. I got to university and loved it so much I never left. I don't come here to bash universities, but the fact that in the university culture is now this cancel culture. And it's not just a problem on the left, because we also see there's a totalitarianism on the right. This lack of tolerance for different views, this inability, and it happened to me as a professor. It hurt me that I would take a stand. I'm an American historian, but I would take a stand, let's say, in favor of Israel or against terrorism. And rather than having somebody come up to me and say, hey, I disagree with you, let's have coffee, they said, oh, you're some evil right-winger, or they cancel you out. That is toxic to democracy. And again, as Natan points out, this isn't coming from the KGB. This isn't coming from above. This is a cancer in our culture. And that's something that we all have to worry about, left and right. And we also see it, of course, in the Jewish community too. The inability to sit and learn from someone who might dare disagree with you. And we're seeing it, of course, in such a difficult way now during the Biden-Trump campaign.
This cancel culture that you talked about, it's something actually in our most recent issue of Moment, Natan, you answered the question, is our society progressing or regressing? And I think you gave a lot of reasons why it seemed like it was regressing. And one of them was cancel culture. But I think you ended up saying that you think we can move to a better society. So I'm curious, what makes you stay so optimistic?
Well, in this book, we are analyzing relations between Jewish people and the state of Israel from three different perspectives. From the perspective of prison, when it was so easy to feel yourself connected to all the Jews of the world and to be empowered by them. In fact, that is the secret of the success of struggle for Soviet Jewry, that with all our different organizations, all the disagreements, there was one aim, which was uniting everybody, and our enemies felt that we are one big movement. And in fact, we were, in spite of all our differences, one big movement. So it was easy to look from the perspective of prison. Then I looked from the perspective of Israeli government, when there is you feel that it is your obligation to make Israel home for all the Jews of the world, and at the same time, you feel very disappointed why Jews of the world don't understand your needs. And then, from the point of diaspora Jewry, where as a Jewish agency head, I had to present the interests and problems and challenges of diaspora Jewry to Israeli government. And when Israel on one hand is a very important tool for strengthening our identity, on the other hand, diaspora Jewry is rightly disappointed when Israel doesn't behave as should the home of all the Jews of the world. But so comparing from three different perspectives, we could see how, in fact, always with all the disagreements, desire to continue our journey as one family, as one tribe through history is very strong. It's really something that unites us above all our disagreements. And sometimes it is very difficult to notice, and that's why we analyze the experience of struggle for Soviet Jewry. When you're in the middle of the struggle, these differences between organizations and mutual accusations are so strong that you must have the effort to remind yourself that there is the mutual aim which is above all this. Well, it was easy. It was enough to look at KGB, your tales of KGB, in order to remind yourself about these mutual enemies. It's much more difficult in everyday life. Nevertheless, we hope that we show to the reader the reasons for our optimism, how in fact there is a deep, deep desire among everywhere, all the right-wing and left-wing and religious and secular Jews in Israel and Jews all over the world, that we as Jewish people will continue our march through history, continue to defend those basic values on which our civilization is built. So, but again, that's reason to be optimistic, but the result in the end depends from the efforts of all of us.
And in the book, when you're talking about the differences between Jews in Israel and Jews in the diaspora, you make this kind of interesting comparison where you call Jews in Israel kind of following the legacy of King David, and then Jews in the diaspora following the legacy of the prophet Yeshayahu, Isaiah. Can you explain a little bit about what you meant by that?
Sure, and this is actually a nice example of how we really collaborated in a very profound way. Natan for a long time had been talking about how you have these two societies, two Jewish communities, two unique Jewish communities in history. You have the American community forged in freedom and forged in many ways in prosperity. And what is the fundamental survival strategy there to make sure that as a minority in this free society, that liberal ideals, the ideals that are often celebrated in the book of Isaiah, are perpetuated. And for a long time, he'd been emphasizing that in Israel, you have a majority Jewish culture, not a minority Jewish culture, that is trying to also, first of all, maintain freedom, but most important, survive surrounded by enemies. And so inevitably, each one of them is going to end up obsessing and often focusing on different things. And I had been playing with this notion of David and Isaiah, because while I read the whole book of Isaiah, and so I know there are also some very tough parts and some violent parts and some particularist parts in Isaiah, at the end of the day, in the United States of America, in the American Jewish community, Isaiah values evoke the Lion and the Lamb, peace, universal justice, etc. And when we talk about King David, we talk about maintaining Jewish sovereignty, although of course he also was an idealist and wanted to play the harp and sing his psalms. So we, in working back and forth together, we took his analysis and my labeling and together in a kind of Vulcan mind meld, if I can quote Star Trek, ended up talking about this notion of a Davidian society, sovereignty, security, safety, and an Isaiah society, universal justice, minority rights. But of course, we also emphasize that Israel wants to be an ideal society. We want to have a Jewish Athens, not a Jewish Sparta. And American Jews, ultimately, most of them, understand the need for patriotism and the need for solidarity. So we don't want to overemphasize that difference. And that becomes the way into what Natan was talking about earlier, which is that we acknowledge difference. We acknowledge there are certain points of divergence, but because we're part of one family. And that's why we annoy each other so much, because we get on each other's nerves, because how come you don't agree with me? How come you can't be like me? That's the key to dialogue, acknowledging difference, but also acknowledging some overarching goal. And none of us wants to be the one who shuts the door and turns out the light on this exciting adventure called the Jewish people. We want to keep it going. And that's also why we keep arguing.
And in part of the book, Natan and Gil, you're talking about something that concerns you, and I think concerns a lot of people who are on this call, the relationship between American Jews and Israel. And what some call the widening gap, which I think is what Gil, you just addressed before. I think it's exemplified by my favorite chapter of the book about the Kotel, what you call the Kotel fiasco. But it's more of a behind the scenes look at the Western Wall compromise, how it came to be, and then how it came not to be. Could you talk a little bit about your involvement in that?
Well, one day, Prime Minister Netanyahu called me, and I'm the chairman of Jewish Agency, and said, Natan, I cannot see these pictures anymore, these Jews fighting with Jews near the Kotel, our most sacred place for Jews. Can you try to check if there is a way to bring all the sides for negotiations? Why he asked me? Because I'm the head of Jewish Agency, and the Jewish Agency really has unique board, unique connection with different groups of Jews all over the world, including Reform Jewry and Conservative Jewry. And also because he knew all my life I'm involved in this debate and tension and trying to decrease the tension between Jews of diaspora and Israel. We write a lot about it in the book. So that's how the negotiations started. I checked with all the sides. I found what is the minimal base on which negotiations can start. And we had unique negotiations which continued for 4 years, which were very difficult because everything about state and religion is difficult. And we describe in the book what were the initial conditions, how it was impossible to meet Reform Jews and representatives of Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox parties a few years ago. And here we have to organize negotiations. And I have to say that these negotiations were successful to the great extent because of the involvement of Prime Minister. And I think we reached new level of understanding between the leaders of non-Orthodox Jewry and the Prime Minister, his office, and the ministers of the government. And then when the compromise was reached and all the details were agreed and government voted for this compromise, then some coalition partners started very big pressure on Prime Minister. And at some moment he decided that it is too dangerous for the future of the coalition, or that he needs this coalition to continue to fight against the threat of Iran and other challenges. And then decision was taken to freeze this compromise, but in fact to cancel it. And I describe really in details and try to show, and we try to show that it's not black and white. It's not that one side is absolutely right and the other is absolutely wrong. That the fears or the anger of liberal Jews, or the fact that Israel doesn't behave as should be the home of all the Jews of the world is sincere and absolutely justified. But distrust of many leaders, of some leaders, that in some critical moments when we are speaking about our security, these people are not with us, was also real. And so the thing is not who is more angry on the other. The thing is how we can overcome this mutual distrust and in fact, and reach that desire of all the sides to be together. Yes, well, it's one of the most unfortunate or disappointing experiences which I had, the fact that our compromise, which was prepared after 4 years of negotiations, was not implemented. I do believe that it will be implemented in the near future, but no doubt that, as we show, much more efforts have to be done from both sides for real serious dialogue about basic issues which seem to divide us, but in the end, at the bottom, they unite us.
And the kotel, of course, is a symbol of our unity. It's a symbol of our unity for 3,000 years. It's a symbol of our unity from bringing us back to King David and the first temple and the second temple. And it also works as kind of like almost a character in the book, because when Natan Sharansky is a 19-year-old student at the Moscow equivalent, the Russian equivalent of MIT, and he hears about the Six-Day War and the anti-Semitic jokes change, and all of a sudden we have the kotel. This is a foreign concept to him, and he starts learning about his identity and then learning about his freedom. When he gives his very powerful speech, when he's sentenced to 13 years in the Gulag, he says, next year in Jerusalem, L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim, as a way of keeping the Jewish people united together. So in part one, the first 9 years that we focus on, we see the kotel, Jerusalem, as this powerful symbol of Jewish unity, this powerful inspiration to a whole generation of Soviet Jews, and of course, American Jews too, and Jews all over the world. In part two, at a crucial moment, when Natan is in the government and Ehud Barak is negotiating in a way that's not being shrewd and not defending core Jewish interests, and he's willing to even consider giving up access to the kotel, Natan Sharansky is one of the people who stands up and says, I've got to resign. I can't be part of a government that's going to give up something that we've fought so hard for. And he makes a very interesting insight that his immigrants party, the so-called left-wingers and right-wingers, were united in their love for Jerusalem. And they were quicker to defend it than Israeli politicians who had been around the block for 5, 10, 15, 20 years or had been born in Israel. And he realized that as new people, as immigrants, they had a particular love and a particular protectiveness for Jerusalem. And then, of course, in the third part of the book, Natan does such amazing work trying to bridge these gaps over the kotel. So the kotel keeps on coming back, yes, sometimes as a point of disunity, but also as that core image of what unites us.
And to go back to when you were talking a little bit about these discussions that you had between the heads of the reform and conservative movements, and then also the ultra-Orthodox ministers in government, there seemed to be a sense of betrayal on both sides. And it seemed as if both kind of, sort of threw up their hands and said, well, if they're not interested in us, we're not interested in them. Do you see that as something that's continuing?
Well, I have about the kotel, there was a feeling of betrayal on the side of liberal Jewry about the decision of Israeli government not to approve the compromise. On the other hand, we show how on the side of Israeli government, there was very often a feeling of betrayal by world Jewry when the world Jewry or American Jewry or liberal American Jewry was not with them when they were speaking about Iranian threat, that the agreement which was signed between Obama administration and Iran was viewed by everybody. Every specialist in Israel was afraid that it will bring to the increase of terrorism, and it brought billions of dollars to the terrorists. And that on this issue, so obvious for the specialists, which the results of this agreement was so that the liberal American Jewry prefers the opinion of their president and not the consideration of security. That really bewildered many politicians. And I tried to show the atmosphere from inside. It happened parallel at the same time. And my feeling was that these are right, these are right, but nobody is betraying nobody. Simply the set of priorities are different. Survival of Jewish state in the Middle East is one thing, and survival of Jewish minority in liberal society is another thing. And how to connect these different sets of priorities with our mutual desire to be together, it's almost not discussed. And that's the problem. And on one hand, we are using this term, maybe the only time in the book, as betrayal, because that's what is used by both sides. On the other hand, we show that it is an absolutely wrong approach. There is no betrayal and no divorce. It's a very difficult way how we have to learn to live together and to continue together our march through history.
Speaking of agreements, I'm curious about your opinion on the new agreement between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain. I know, in the book you talk about being against Oslo, the disengagement, and a lot of that has to do with being against working with dictators in general. How do you view this agreement?
Well, I think that is a historical agreement. There is potential for changing all the reality of the Middle East and bring a real new page in the relations between Israel and Arab countries. And how it is different from Oslo. In Oslo, we brought a dictator from Tunis to Palestinians. I said, Palestinians, this dictator will be your dictator, take it or leave it, and we will make sure that he will be strong because he will deliver us peace. And from the very beginning, 1 week after this, I wrote my first article against Oslo, explaining why peace cannot be built by this. In the case, and we write a lot about this in this book. In here, what's happened here, we were not bringing any dictatorship. Of course, these states are not democracy, and in some way they are dictatorships. But these dictatorships, which we didn't create, well, what we did do together with them, we found that we have mutual interest, and this peace agreement, which is signed, or normalization agreement, is not imposed. It's built from bottom up. Look, even in our agreements with Egypt and Jordan until this day, no businessman, no actor, no singer will dare to come to Israel because public opinion in this country is absolutely against. Here, from the very beginning, all the public opinion in these countries wants cooperation with Israel, wants tourism. The singers are studying Hebrew to go to the concerts. Our banks are signing already agreements about joint ventures. Our film studios are discussing mutual. So there is a lot of enthusiasm, and that destroys this dogma, which was for many years shared by the free world, that the only way for normal relations between Arab world and Israel, in fact, Arab world and free world, is to impose peace agreement on Israel and Palestine. In fact, authority, which was in the past terrorist authority, Palestine was using it all the time as a way of blackmail and deciding that they can mobilize all the world to press on Israel, and it didn't work. Here, when it comes from the bottom up, that is a real chance, and I think in the end it does bring more chance also for real peace negotiations between Palestinians and Israel, and real peace.
It's kind of ironic. For years, people have been yelling from the left, peace now, and saying you make peace with dictators. You don't make peace necessarily with your friends. And now all of a sudden, when there's an agreement that is adding to the pile of peace in the world, that is detracting from the enmity and the hatred in the world, these forces that love to call for peace now somehow have their problems with this peace. And these forces that say, oh, you have to make peace with dictators, don't want a peace with this particular group of dictators. And we're very clear to say, obviously, you prefer to make peace with democracies. But if Israel said, we're only going to make peace with democracies, we'd never have a shot at peace. And we're actually seeing how toxic it is, what the Palestinians have done for the last 20 years, the Palestinian leadership has done for the last 20 years with their anti-normalization. Because the little steps forward, the little baby steps, the little additions to the pile of peace in the world that can grow and grow and grow through artistic cooperation, through business cooperation, through just human touch, has been frozen, has been cut off when it comes to Palestinians and Israelis, not from the Israeli side, but from the Palestinian leadership side. And now we have a kind of test case of what happens, and the excitement, both in Israel and in the Arab world, in parts of the Arab world, when you have an opportunity to say, hey, wait a minute, we have an opportunity to build peace. And there's a flip side to it too, which is that there are three major reasons why this peace agreement is going forward: Iran, Iran, and Iran. That we're well aware of the fact that this also has to do with the fear in Bahrain, in the United Arab Emirates, in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, of Iran and of Hezbollah. And yeah, the enemy of my enemy is sometimes my friend, but that's, when we find multi-dimensional mutual interests, then like a strong piece of rope, we have many different strands that can reinforce one another rather than having peace on one thin string that's top down. This is bottom up.
And I want to leave time for questions, but I think I do have to ask about the protests that are currently happening in Israel. They seem, at least on my Facebook feed, it seems to be growing larger and larger by the day. I'm curious, what are both of your thoughts on them, and if they'll be effective?
So
Gil, you can start.
I mean, first of all, there are many the protests. This is actually one of the confusing things. There have been, unfortunately, this week, and it's very painful to watch, violent outbursts between some ultra-Orthodox population and the police. There have been every Saturday night in front of Bibi Netanyahu's house, now going back for 3-4 months, protests by a very broad coalition of people. I mean, to call them left is oversimplifying, because some of them are shopkeepers, some of them are artists, some of them are people who want Netanyahu out. So look, the good news is that while there has been some violence, it's actually been quite limited. There hasn't been massive looting. We haven't seen the real out of control kind of violence we saw in the United States over the summer. The good news is that we are in a free society. The bad news is that we really are at a point of great impasse, at a point of great frustration. I can't predict what's going to happen tomorrow anywhere in the world these days. I say I'm a historian. It's hard enough for me to predict the past. I can't begin to predict the future. So it's very hard to know what the protests will accomplish. But we are going through a very difficult period. We're now also in our, third week of lockdown, third week of the second round of the Corona lockdown. And so, yeah, there's a lot of tension in Israeli society, a lot of concern. But one of the things we try to point out in the book is we give Israel what we call the road test, which is you don't just look at today. You don't just look at 2020, but you say 2020 compared to 2000, 2020 compared to 1980, compared to 1950. What Israel would you rather be in? And as with a car, in which direction is it going? What are the directional signals? And when we see that on almost any indicator, Israel is going to be a more open, a more tolerant, a more democratic, a more free, a more prosperous, a more Arab-friendly society, we say, yeah, there are problems. We're not naive, but we also see that the direction is on the whole quite good. And that's part of the reason why I think both of us are also just sort of born optimists. With our historic sense, we compare what was and what is, and we're optimists. And also we are Zionists, and both Golda Meir and David Ben-Gurion said, you can't be a Zionist and a pessimist. So we're good Zionists, so we're optimists.
Yeah, I'll tell, in the beginning, I was very skeptical about these demonstrations because they all started from this, that, well, there were elections, Bibi Netanyahu as a result is the prime minister. We don't want him prime minister. We want him to resign. And you are not canceling the results of elections through demonstration. On the other hand, at the same time, there were voices on the right and or from Likud. The people spoke through elections. Why do we need trial? And of course, I was absolutely against it. The elections cannot be cancelled and trial cannot be cancelled. You must have both. But that was in the beginning. With the time, it became more and more protest against this feeling that at the time of such a big crisis, we don't see the leadership from the government. And when people become unemployed and they feel very strong that it's not justified, when they're feeling that the government doesn't have clear strategy about corona, then the reaction is as it should be during democracy, by the way. They express their disagreements. And now, if you look at the demonstrations, Gil is right. There were those who, on the left, simply politically didn't want Bibi the power, in spite of the fact, by the way, that Bibi had a tremendous contribution to in many spheres, and we write about it in this book. And at the same time, now with his trial, is the time for him to resign. And there is another big group which says, no, we don't want that economy will be closed. Or those who say, why our economy was closed so late? And so they are against this situation of uncertainty, and they're accusing the lack of leadership. So that's why it's very difficult even to characterize these demonstrations. I think that these passions will go down if really the government will succeed to deal with the second wave of corona. And well, in the last 3 days, we become cautiously optimistic, but really at this moment, people of Israel don't feel such a strong leadership as was during the first wave of corona. And that creates to this feeling that this government doesn't know how to lead. Let's have the other government. The thing is that in the end, it means new elections. And this will prove that it has very strong democracy, and people speak and without any interruption. And if the result will be new elections, then we'll have new elections.
I think there's obviously some parallels to what you were saying, what's happening in the US as well. Suzanne, I don't know if you want to go to questions. I see we have a bunch.
Yep. So I'm going to start with two. Thank you both very much for sharing. We've gotten a lot of people writing in how much they've enjoyed it. This one is for you, Natan. Did you have access to Jewish texts while growing up in the Soviet Union? And did they give you and your outlook strength during imprisonment? And then I'll add another question in there. Were you aware of the worldwide efforts to help in your release while you were imprisoned?
First of all, we write a lot about it in this book too. One third of the book is practically about it. And the title, Never Alone, is also the answer to this question. No, in my childhood, in the first 18 years of my life, I had no access to anything Jewish. As I said, there were no Jewish institutions, no Jewish tradition, no Jewish language, no place where you can go and buy books on all these topics, no synagogue, no bar mitzvah, no brit milah. The only really Jewish thing which existed in my life was anti-Semitism. A lot of anti-Semitism. It is written in the idea of your parents Jew, and there is a lot of consequences for this. Now, I did get access to the text and to the history and to the tradition when I became Jewish activist. And thanks God that before I was arrested, I had quite a few years of active involvement in Jewish life, which I was just learning. And as a spokesman of our movement, I was actively involved and contacted many representatives of Jewish organizations who were coming as tourists. So I did know the power of solidarity of Jews of the world. And this feeling of empowerment from the world Jewry, from Israel, of course, I took with me to prison. Now, in prison, I knew very little. In a year and a half of interrogations, before the trial, I knew zero. Then, in the 9 years of imprisonment, I had 2 personal meetings with the family in which I, of course, could get some information. But I knew regularly very, very little. But I was absolutely sure, simply from knowing, from remembering the power of this feeling of solidarity and desire to fight together with us, I was absolutely sure that Jewish people, the state of Israel, and my wife, or my wife, Israel, and Jewish people, continue their struggle. And when I was released, I was very happy to see that the reality, that what I imagined, that was the real world and not what KGB was telling me.
Thank you. Somebody emailed actually a question wanting to know currently, are there active synagogues that are accepted and tolerated by the government?
In the Soviet Union.
In the Soviet
Union, are there
Russia.
active? Is there freedom of religion now in the
What is the
Soviet
situation
today?
Yeah.
First of all, there is no Soviet Union today, thanks God.
Right.
But yes, in the former Soviet Union, and specifically in Russia and Ukraine, Jews, first of all, there is no official state anti-Semitism. In fact, Russian representatives were encouraging me many times to condemn Ukrainian anti-Semitism, and Ukrainian representatives tried to convince me to condemn Russian anti-Semitism. And I will said, look, with all my criticism, especially that I have a lot of criticism as a human rights activist about the policy of Russian government, but we have to say the truth. There is no state anti-Semitism at this moment, neither in Russia, nor in Ukraine, nor in other republics. More than this, the Jewish communities can live as Jewish communities. They can freely communicate with the other Jews. And as the head of Jewish Agency had a huge operation all over the former Soviet Union, was in encouraging Aliyah and helping with Aliyah and in strengthening Jewish identity in the field. And the authorities didn't create any problems. That is the huge achievement of our struggle, that Iron Curtain fell, 2 million Jews left former Soviet Union, and those who stayed, if they want, they can have enjoy Jewish life. Yeah.
And in the book, we tell this crazy story about how Natan is basically kicked out of the Soviet Union and leaves on that extraordinary day, February 11th, 1986. And then when the next time he comes back to the former Soviet Union, to Russia, he's there as a member of the cabinet representing Israel and the Jewish people. And it's a triumphal tour. So what a change, and what a shift, not only in his life, but in world history.
Thank you. You were talking a little while ago about acknowledging differences, but the question is, how do we actually get people to want to acknowledge differences and get back to a time of debate and conversation and move away from bullying and cancel culture?
Well, one of the things we're very good at doing is creating conversations over what we disagree on. And we say, oh, you know, can we agree to disagree? I think we also have to think about, can we agree to agree? So sometimes I'm asked on campus to get into some debate, Israelis versus Palestinians or left versus right. And I say, why don't we shift first? Why don't we read some Zionist texts? Why don't we first start talking about peoplehood? Why don't we first start talking about what we have in common? And when you do that, when you go through, and you this isn't just kumbaya empty stuff. This is, you know, read tough, complicated, thoughtful, substantive visions of what Israel should be, of who we are as a people, about what Zionism means. You have a conversation about that, and then in the second half of your conversation, if you talk about the territories, if you talk about the conflict between religious and non-religious, all of a sudden, A, you have a common vocabulary, B, you have certain shared interests, and C, you've created a different tone. So part of it really is almost tactically changing the conversation. And then the second part of it is, and we keep on coming back to this in the book, is dialogue is a skill. And it means having to be able to tolerate a little bit difference and making a conscious choice to choose unity, to think about the bigger issues, not just about the issues right in front of your nose at that moment.
You know, one of the things that I was telling the head of Jewish Agency, to our shlichim to campuses, that our representatives to the university, the project which I initiated and I'm very proud of. I was saying, your aim is not to convince our enemies that we are good, that we are not so bad, that it's lies. Your challenge is to convince Jews, to show to the Jews that they don't have to be ashamed of being associated with Israel. In fact, they have a lot to be proud of, because whatever is the level of your disagreement with the policy of this government or that government, Israel brought such a huge change in the life of Jewish people. It gave a new type of self-confidence in our future. And let's discuss what it is. Why birthrights is so powerful, and we write a lot about it. Why coming for 10 days for people who are very left or who are very right, who are absolutely very religious, who are absolutely against religion? What really this spending time in Israel changes in their life? And let's start discussing these things. And by the way, and vice versa, Israelis, when they are invited to really to think how the world changed, how different is life in diaspora, in American diaspora community, with many different forms of Jewish life which were developed in comparison with what was 50 years ago, and how in fact their dreams about the future of Jewish people and our dreams are similar. If you start discussing this and then go to the debate and to disagreements which will remain, but then your desire to compromise on these disagreements is much bigger. And well, and we are proposing some practical ways how to organize this dialogue debate.
Thank you. It's good advice for college students who often feel like deer in headlights and really don't know how to manage campus. So thank you for that. Someone would like to know, would Israel be a better place if it could have separation of synagogue and state? Wouldn't this eliminate coalition controlled by the ultra-Orthodox and thus solve the Kotel problem, for one?
Well, you know, you can solve Kotel problem and make it impossible the existence of the state. So I don't think that that's the right order to look at the things. We describe here in this book the history of all this status quo agreement, compromise between state and religion. And it doesn't go to the Bibi's government or to Begin's government, it goes straight to Ben-Gurion before the creation of the state of Israel. Because, and we are paying very big price for this. But who knows whether there was a way to create the state differently, because there is no recipe, there is no device how in the history you're creating the state from the nation, from hundreds of different groups which understand the word Jew differently. There are Jews for whom identity is their religion. And in fact, many American Jews believe to this day that Jew means religion. And there are Jews for whom identity is the nationhood. There are Jews for whom identity, like for me, it was anti-Semitism. It was like reaction on anti-Semitism, and so on and so on and so on. And when you have to bring all this from exile and to find common denominator, you cannot take Judaism out of this. After all, only think about all the history of survival of Jews for 1,000 years and take Judaism out of this, it will all fall apart. So Judaism had to be inside the building.
I'm going to step in because we seem to have lost Natan. The
of this national
you know, I would distinguish between the problem of the Rabbanut and the problem of separation of church and state. And you could figure out ways to deal with an anti-Zionist rabbinate, which is a serious issue, without then going so far down the path of blurring synagogue and state. And let's point out that in Europe, there are 27 countries with crosses on their flags. Throughout the Muslim world, they put their crescent on the flag. So there's a lot of blurring of church and state in other countries, but somehow when Israel does it, it makes Israel illegitimate. And I'll go even further, wearing my American history hat. In the United States of America, we're well aware that even though Thomas Jefferson talked about a high impregnable wall separating church and state, it ain't that impregnable. It ain't that high. That there are all kinds of blurrings, because human beings, and especially when we look at Western democracies and the way democracy started, there's a lot of blurring between questions of sovereignty and kingship and godship, which then even were translated into our increasingly secular democracy in the United States of America and our hybrid in Israel. So I would hate to see the Jewishness of Israel neutered. I would hate to see a neutral public square, a naked public square, but both of us in different ways have certainly criticized the harshness and the lack of patriotism, frankly, of the modern rabbinate.
Thank you. Thank you both. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. This has been a phenomenal discussion. Thank you both for participating. I do, though, want to offer you both, if you both have something to say that you'd like to depart with us, that would be great. I mean, I think so much, we've seen so much parallel with what's going on in Israel and the United States. And what words of wisdom do you have to share with everybody, the optimism that you both have?
Thank you.
Beware of false choices that, you know, especially in a presidential election year, but increasingly in our culture, people are said, well, you have to choose between liberalism and nationalism. You have to choose between universalism and particularism. You have to choose between being a proud Zionist and a proud feminist, or a proud LGBTQ activist, or proud supporter of fights against racism. No. Sometimes making these marriages can be a little bit difficult, but human beings are able to balance. And I think one of the central themes of the book, and one of the keys of dialogue, is saying, no, you can be a liberal and a nationalist. You can be a universalist and a particularist. In fact, we've seen through Natan Sharansky's story, through Nelson Mandela's story, that by having personal pride, by knowing your identity, that's how you fight for freedom. And so the more we juggle, the more we then have an opportunity to open up different points of inquiry and different points of agreement with people, rather than going to one extreme or another. So the book is very much a call for dialogue, but is also very much a cry against extremism. And we believe that in the modern world, the shrill extremists are trying to run the conversation, and we're trying to say there is a majority, a sometimes silenced majority, that wants to juggle, that wants to balance, and we want to be their voice, and we want to invite all of them and all of you to be that voice too.
Thank you. Natan?
Yeah, well, in fact, what we are saying, what we're trying to say in the end, and that's very relevant today, don't let our political disagreements, which are very big, and in today's polarized world, they will be even bigger, I can assure you. Don't let them to jam, to blind us about that base which makes us one family. And because we do want to continue to exist as a family, as a Jewish family in future, that is the base of our common interest. And find the way to overcome this, not to deny this political difference, but to see behind these political differences that there is something which unites us much stronger. And that's, in fact, the base of our optimism. And one more thing, continuing what Gil said, that's what I'm saying to many young Jews on the campuses, that if you want to change the world, and practically every young Jew wants to change the world. Tikkun olam, it's like the sacred concept. If you want to change the world, if you want to be real universalists, there is only one source of energy which can, because it needs a lot of energy, a lot of devotion. There is only one source. It's your family, your tribe, your identity, your history. That's what gives you a lot of strength to work for the better of the world. And that is the truth which I discovered in Soviet Union, when my connection to two movements gave me a lot of strength. And that's true also today. We should not permit, in fact, to our opponents to divide the world into nationalists and liberals. It's false division. It has to be together. That is the unique role of Jewish people and the state of Israel, to make these two concepts together.
And of course, the book Never Alone is on sale at Amazon and all fine bookstores everywhere.
Absolutely. Thank you both. On behalf of Sarah and myself, really thank you, and thank everybody for coming. Also, please join us next week for the State of Jewish Journalism. Sarah, I'm sorry, did you want to say one more thing?
Oh, no, I just wanted to thank both Gil and Natan, and also encourage people to read the book, because I think it adds a kind of a sliver of hope in a time when things don't feel so hopeful.
Yes,
Thank you.
Thanks it all.
And again, thank you for everybody for joining us. If you've enjoyed today's program, we encourage you to go to our website, momentmag.com, and please make a donation and help us continue programming like this. And as Gil and Natan both said, go out and buy the book. Thank you.